The story of Moses is a story of redemption, of divine purpose revealed in the midst of deeply complicated human circumstances. Moses' life begins in a context of oppression and hopelessness for the people of Israel, a people who suffered under slavery in Egypt. In those days, Pharaoh, fearful of the growth of the Israelite people, gave a cruel order. All male children born to Israelite women were to be thrown into the Nile. It was a death sentence for all newborns. However, Moses' mother, in an act of courage and faith, decides to defy this decree. She places it in a basket and lets it float in the river, trusting that somehow God would take care of it. In that small act of obedience, which seemed desperate and insignificant, the beginning of a liberation was taking shape that would change the history of Israel forever. Moses was not simply a child saved from death, he was one chosen by God, although at the time no one knew the divine purpose behind his life. Raised in Pharaoh's palace, Moses lived a life full of privilege and comfort. He was raised like a prince, surrounded by wealth and power. However, something within him never allowed him to forget his true origin, his true identity. He knew that his people were being oppressed, that they were suffering under the yoke of slavery. This internal conflict between the comfort of the palace and the injustice suffered by its people marked him deeply. As he grew older, Moses began to look for ways to help his people, but the way he first tried to do it was wrong. One day, he saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite, and without thinking twice, Moses killed the Egyptian. His action, although motivated by a desire for justice, was reckless. Moses not only killed a man, but he also risked his life doing so. Pharaoh, upon learning of the incident, wanted to kill him, and Moses was forced to flee Egypt, fleeing the wrath of the king who had been his protector. At that time, Moses left the palace and retired to the desert of Midian, a secluded and lonely place where he spent many years tending sheep. During those years, Moses found himself in a situation that seemed like a total setback, a time of concealment and internal struggle. In the desert, Moses went from being a prince of Egypt to being a simple shepherd. But although on the surface it seemed that Moses' life was stagnant, God was preparing his heart and spirit for the challenge ahead. The story of Moses teaches us that sometimes, in moments of apparent failure or isolation, God is working in us deeply, forming our character and preparing our lives for the mission he has for us. The years Moses spent in the desert were not in vain. In that secluded place, Moses had time to reflect on his life, his decisions, and his people. God was molding Moses into the man who was to be the leader of Israel's deliverance. One day, while Moses was herding sheep near Mount Horeb, he encountered a vision that would change his life forever. A bush was burning with flames, but it was not consumed. This peculiar sight surprised him deeply, and as he approached, he heard the voice of God speaking to him from the bush. God identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and told Moses that he had heard the cry of his people, and that the time had come to free them from slavery in Egypt. This was the divine call that would transform Moses from a simple shepherd into the leader who would lead Israel to freedom. Moses at first doubted his ability to carry out such a mission. He felt insufficient, unable to face such a powerful and feared Pharaoh. He wondered how could he, a common man, defy the king of Egypt and free his people. But God answered him clearly and firmly, "I will be with you." It was not Moses who was going to perform the task, but it was God who would do it through him. God gave Moses a series of signs and miracles to show that he was with him and would have his back every step of the way. Moses had to go to Egypt, talk to Pharaoh, and demand that he free the Israelites. But he had to not only speak, he had to show the powerful acts of God. Moses, who had begun life as a child floating on the waters of the Nile, now became the divine instrument who would challenge Pharaoh and change the destiny of his people. The story of Moses is not only about a man chosen by God to free the Israelites, but about the revelation of how God acts in the midst of the impossible. Throughout the life of Moses, we see how God takes the most adverse circumstances and, with his power, turns them into the means to fulfill his purpose. The story of Israel's liberation is a testimony of God's faithfulness, of how he is able to do the impossible. Moses, a man who began life amid oppression and internal strife, was transformed into the leader of a nation. God not only used him to deliver Israel, but he prepared him, formed him, and sent him in his name to do great wonders. The life of Moses reminds us that no matter how great the task before us, or how small or fragile we feel, God has the power to transform us, to empower us, and to carry out his will through us. It does not matter how far we are from perfection or how fragile our strength is, because in moments of weakness the power of God is made perfect. Moses, being called by God, not only witnessed divine power, but became a channel for that power to manifest. His life story is a reminder that although our lives may seem limited by pain, failure, or weakness, God has a greater purpose for each of us. The deliverance of Israel, guided by Moses, is a testimony that when God intervenes, circumstances change, chains are broken, and God's people are restored. Moses' life is not only an example of obedience, but also of the profound transformation that God can bring about in those who surrender to his calling, regardless of what they have experienced or what they think of themselves. In moments of doubt and difficulty, let us remember that it is not our strength that determines the outcome, but the faithfulness of a God who never leaves us or forsakes us. Moses' call to the service of God was not only an act of obedience, but also a process of inner transformation. The man who had been raised in the palace, a prince of Egypt, was stripped of his pride and the self-sufficiency he had acquired during his youth. His flight into the desert was not simply a physical exile, but a spiritual retreat where God formed him and prepared him for the mission he had for him. In the wilderness, Moses was molded into a leader who was humble and dependent on divine direction. Over the years, God was working on his character, teaching him to trust him and give up his own understanding. Moses, like many of us, had to face his own fears, doubts, and limitations before he could be the instrument of deliverance that God had intended for him. When Moses received the call from the burning bush, his first reactions were fear and resistance. He felt incapable. He doubted his ability to fulfill what God asked of him. How could he, a man who had fled Egypt, return there and confront Pharaoh? What would the people of Israel say? Moses, like us, had a distorted image of himself. He saw himself as a man who had failed, someone whose past disqualified him for such a great task. However, what God was showing him was not just his past identity or failures, but his ability to transform what seems useless into something wonderful. God does not see our story as a condemnation, but as an opportunity to display his redemptive power. In the divine call of Moses, we can see the fundamental principle of God's grace. He calls the imperfect, those whom the world has discarded, to carry out his purpose. Moses was not the ideal candidate from a human perspective. He was not an eloquent speaker. He was not an experienced warrior, nor a man who inspired confidence because of his past. But God does not look for those who are perfect, but for those who are willing to surrender to his will. Moses' humility, born of his experience in the wilderness, was what qualified him to be used by God in such a powerful way. God not only formed him in the wilderness, but transformed him into a leader who could lead his people in their own experience of liberation. The fact that Moses was not alone on this mission is another important aspect that we must remember. Although the task seemed overwhelming, God promised Moses that he would be with him. This promise of God's presence is what gives believers the confidence to face any challenge. It is not about our strength or ability, but about the grace and power of God operating through us. Moses, like us, felt vulnerable and weak under the magnitude of the mission, but God assured him that he would not have to face Pharaoh and Egypt alone. The divine presence became the force that moved Moses to act bravely, despite his fears and doubts. The story of Israel's liberation shows how the power of God transforms everything that seems impossible. In the encounter with Pharaoh, Moses was not fighting just against a man, but against the forces of evil that were holding God's people captive. Every time Moses faced Pharaoh, it was not just a human challenge, but a manifestation of the spiritual struggle between light and darkness. Throughout the narrative, we see how God is glorified through every sign and wonder that Moses performs in his name. The plagues that fall on Egypt are not just punishments, but signs of God's authority and power. Every plague is a reminder that no human power can resist the living and almighty God. What is impressive about the story of Moses is how, despite the difficulties and moments of uncertainty, God never stopped intervening in the lives of his people. Each time Pharaoh hardened his heart and rejected God's call, Moses was instructed to perform another sign. The liberation of Israel was not an isolated act, but a process that showed an entire nation and subsequent generations the faithfulness and sovereignty of God. Sometimes liberation processes are not immediate, but they always have a divine purpose. Through Pharaoh's resistance, God not only displayed his power, but also strengthened the faith of his people, preparing them for what would come after deliverance. One of the most significant moments in the history of Israel's liberation was when Moses, guided by God, led the people through the Red Sea. This event was not only a physical miracle, but a representation of what happens when we follow divine direction. When Moses raised his staff over the sea, the water parted, allowing the people of Israel to walk through on dry ground. This act of faith and obedience was a testimony to God's sovereignty over nature itself. In the middle of what seemed like a dead end, when the army of Egypt approached from behind and the sea surrounded them from before, God made a way where none existed. This teaches us that when God calls us to something, he will also provide the way, even when all seems lost. The deliverance of the people of Israel also shows how God guides his people, even in times of uncertainty. After crossing the Red Sea, the people began to walk through the desert, an arid and difficult place. Despite the miraculous deliverance, they began to complain, fearful and distrustful that God would abandon them. Moses, however, stood firm, guided by God's direction. In that wilderness, the people of Israel were transformed, and each challenge they faced showed them a new facet of God's faithfulness. Just as Moses had been transformed in the desert, the people also had to go through a training process where they would learn to trust God and depend completely on him. God showed his presence and provision in amazing ways in the wilderness. He gave them manna from heaven to feed them, water from a rock to quench their thirst, and he guided them with a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. Each of these miraculous acts not only provided what was necessary for physical survival, but also strengthened the faith of the people of Israel, teaching them that God was with them at every moment, guiding and sustaining them. Through these experiences, Moses became not only the leader of Israel, but a symbol of God's faithfulness to his people. The journey through the desert was, without a doubt, a fundamental stage in the liberation process of the people of Israel. This period, which spanned 40 years, was more than a simple physical movement from one place to another. It was a spiritual experience that marked the character of the nation of Israel. In that desert, the people not only faced the harshness of the environment, but also internal temptations such as complaint, lack of faith, and idolatry. The story of the departure from Egypt and the challenges they faced in the desert reflect the constant struggle between dependence on God and human self-sufficiency. The people of Israel, after being freed from the slavery of Egypt, encountered a reality much more difficult than they had imagined. Despite having witnessed amazing miracles such as the passage through the Red Sea, the plagues in Egypt, and the daily supply of manna, they began to complain. This was not for lack of miracles, but for lack of understanding of what God wanted to do in their hearts. The desert was not only a place of physical testing, but also spiritual. There, the people had to learn to trust God completely, to understand that their daily provision depended on him, and that they could not live in the past, but rather walk towards the future that God had promised them. Moses, as God's chosen leader, was charged with guiding them through this difficult but essential lesson, that their true liberation was not only found in leaving Egypt, but in the process of learning to depend on God in all aspects of life. Every time the people complained, Moses found himself in the difficult position of mediating between God and his people. Deep down, Moses was also part of that training process, because as a leader, he had to teach the nation to see God's faithfulness through their own struggles. At times, Moses felt overwhelmed by the Israelites' complaints and lack of faith, but despite his own doubts and frustrations, he did not stop interceding for them before God. His life was a testament to perseverance in faith, even when everything around him seemed to fall apart. Moses was not only a leader, but also an intercessor who understood that the people needed more than just material provisions, They needed a spiritual renewal. One of the most revealing moments in this experience was when the people of Israel began to idolize a golden calf. While Moses was on the mountain receiving the law from God, the people, desperate due to the lack of visibility of their leader, took gold from their own possessions and melted it down to make an idol. This act of idolatry was a clear manifestation of a lack of trust in God's providence. Not only had the people been freed from slavery, but they were now being freed from a mentality of dependence on earthly things, such as gold or idols. God had been leading them, but when the situation got complicated, they returned to what they knew: idolatry. Moses, coming down from the mountain, saw what had happened and, in an act of justice and pain, destroyed the golden calf. This incident was not only a challenge for Moses as a leader, but also a crucial teaching for the people. The lesson was clear: you cannot walk in freedom if you do not completely renounce the things that bind us, whether visible or internal idolatries. Throughout this time, Moses was constantly interceding for the people. His relationship with God was deep, and he understood that, although the people had fallen into sin, God's mercy could restore them. Moses became the mediator between the holiness of God and the rebellious people, begging for forgiveness and restoration of the nation. In the book of Exodus, we see how Moses repeatedly interceded, even when God threatened to destroy the nation and start over with him. In these moments, Moses showed his pastoral heart, willing to sacrifice himself for the well-being of the people. His love and commitment to the Israelites were a reflection of the character of God, who never abandons his people, even when they fail. Despite their efforts, the rebellion did not completely cease. As they advanced into the desert, the people continued to face challenges, both internal and external. Moses had to deal with moments of doubt and mistrust among the people, but he never stopped guiding them. However, his life was not only one of trials and difficulties, it was also a life of revelation of the greatness of God. Throughout his ministry, Moses witnessed the direct presence of God. At Mount Sinai, he received the tables of the law, a covenant that would be the basis for Israel's relationship with their God. The law given to Moses was not only a set of rules, but a manifestation of divine will, designed to guide the nation toward holiness and obedience. However, the law also made clear that humanity alone could not meet God's standards. The law showed the need for a savior, for a mediator between God and man, which pointed, although implicitly, towards the redemptive work of Christ. The people, for their part, did not always understand the purpose of the law and divine instructions. For the most part, the law became a reminder of their inability to meet God's perfection. But through Moses, God not only gave them the law, but also the promise that he would always be with them, guiding them and preparing them to enter the promised land. Moses, like many of the great leaders of the Bible, was a man who knew that God's work in his life did not end with miracles or momentary victories, but with fidelity to the task entrusted to him. And so, although he himself did not enter the promised land due to his own mistakes, his life was a testimony of God's faithfulness and a reminder that God's plan moves forward, even when we do not understand why. It is important to reflect on how the story of Moses connects to our daily lives. We all face moments of doubt and difficulty, and like Moses, we can feel that our circumstances are overwhelming us. However, the life of Moses teaches us that in the midst of the struggle, God is with us. No matter how difficult things become, God's faithfulness never leaves us. Moses was an ordinary man who faced extraordinary challenges, but God used him to carry out his plan. This is a key lesson. It is not our strength that carries us forward, but the grace of God working in us. Moses' life, marked by challenges, miracles, and divine teachings, extends beyond the liberation of Israel. He was not only a leader, but a man of God who experienced a profound transformation throughout his ministry. From his encounter with God at the burning bush to his death on the hills of Moab, Moses witnessed the continuous revelation of God's will. Moses' relationship with God was unique. He was not only a leader for the people of Israel, but an intercessor and close friend of God. In Exodus 33:11, we are told that Moses spoke with God face to face, as a man does with his friend. This level of intimacy with the Creator is impressive and shows us that closeness to God does not depend on the perfection of our life, but on the disposition of our heart. In this process of deliverance, Moses was also the means through which God made his presence tangible to his people. Throughout the journey, the cloud that guided the Israelites during the day and the fire that illuminated the camp at night were manifestations of God's presence. The people, like Moses, had to learn to recognize this presence and depend on it. It was not enough to see the miracles and signs. The people had to learn to trust in God's direction and his plan, even if they did not understand all the details. This trust is a central theme in the life of Moses and in Israel's journey. In fact, the life of Moses tells us about the importance of walking by faith, even when we don't see immediate results. At various points, Moses experienced the frustration of seeing his people doubt, complain, and rebel, and at times wondered if his mission would succeed, but God continually reminded him that his work was greater than any temporary obstacle. Likewise, we sometimes face situations that seem insurmountable, but we must remember that we are not fighting alone. Moses, throughout his life, learned that, although the difficulties were many, God was with him, guiding him, strengthening his faith and his leadership. One of the most revealing episodes in Moses' life occurred when God commanded him to speak to the rock so that water would flow from it. But Moses, tired and frustrated by the people's lack of faith, struck the rock instead of speaking to it. As a result, Moses was unable to enter the promised land. This episode is a reminder that, although God uses imperfect people, he is not willing to tolerate disobedience from those he calls for a mission. Although Moses was an exceptional leader, his disobedience had consequences, and this lesson teaches us that we must be faithful to God's leading, even in the most difficult times. The moment of Moses' transfiguration is another significant event in the history of the liberation of the people of Israel. On Mount Sinai, Moses ascended to receive the tables of the law, an act that was not only a religious rite, but a reaffirmation of the covenant between God and his people. Moses not only received the law as a set of rules, but he lived them in his own life. His relationship with the law was profound, because he understood that it was not a simple set of rules, but a means to get closer to God's will and live according to his justice. The law, far from being a burden, was a means for restoring the relationship between human beings and God. Although the people of Israel struggled to understand the law, Moses embraced it as a manifestation of God's holiness and a path to salvation. The life of Moses also offers us a reflection on leadership. Moses was neither a leader who sought personal glory, nor a leader who relied on his own power. His leadership was based on his obedience to God and his willingness to serve the people. Throughout his life, Moses was able to overcome his own fears and insecurities. Although he began his ministry feeling incapable of leading, God enabled him and strengthened him to carry out the task he had given him. Moses, therefore, was not only a leader of the people of Israel, but an example of what it means to be a leader willing to follow God's leading, no matter what difficulties or challenges come along the way. The fact that Moses could not enter the Promised Land, despite having been the leader who freed Israel from slavery, is a deep subject for reflection. Moses had been obedient to God in so many areas of his life, but his disobedience at a crucial moment had consequences. This episode is not only a warning, but an opportunity to understand that our actions, although they do not always have immediate consequences, do have long-term effects. The life of Moses reminds us that we must be faithful in everything, not only in easy times, but also in times of trial. Obedience to God does not always lead to immediate or visible results, but it always leads to true blessing, which is peace with God and the assurance that we are doing His will. In the death of Moses, when he climbed Mount Nebo and saw the promised land from afar but could not enter it, a cycle of leadership closes that was not only a testimony of his faithfulness to God, but also a testimony of God's faithfulness to the people of Israel. Moses died with the promise that the land would be given to the people, and although he did not live to see the fulfillment of that promise, his life and work were fundamental to the realization of God's plan. In the story of Moses, we see how God uses ordinary, imperfect, and sometimes fragile people to carry out His eternal purpose. Moses was not only the leader who led Israel out of Egypt, he was the man who, through his life, taught the people of Israel to trust in God's provision, to walk in faith, to obey His voice, and to understand that God's purpose is much greater than momentary difficulties. He showed that obedience to God, faith in His word, and dependence on His grace are the foundations for any process of liberation, personal and collective. It is true that the story of Moses did not end with his death, because his legacy continues through the history of the people of Israel, and later, through the teachings that his experiences left behind. In the New Testament, Moses remains a model of faith and obedience for believers. His life reminds us that even when we face impossible situations, we are not alone. Moses did not live to see the full fulfillment of the promises, but his life of obedience and faith became an eternal testimony of the faithfulness of God, who keeps what He promises.